So I've tried to remain pure in what it is that I'm good at, which is the scaling stage. For example, I don't really work with startups.
You've recorded more than 100 episodes, right? About scaling. You've increased revenues of companies you've held by $100 million throughout your career. What's the thing that nobody asks you about scale, or that everybody underestimates, but yet you're like, this is something people don't think of?
So those are the 4 things I think you have to do well in order to scale a business. Sort of maximum scale and maximum exit optionality. You may choose never to exit, but if you build your business in such a way that it's always exit ready, then you always have options. You can step back from it, you can keep scaling it up, or you can sell it. Welcome to the Scale HQ podcast, your weekly injection of tips and insights into the secrets of scaling. I'm your host, Sean Steele, and I am obsessed with figuring out how to help founders just like you who are creating real value in the world to scale up so they can fulfill their potential. I do that each week by interviewing founders who successfully scaled, experts in all the areas of business that you need to master, interviews with founders who are still on the way up, and 10-minute tutorials and reflections from me based on my experiences in creating $100 million in revenue for 4 other companies over 8 years. So let's dive in and see what gems we can find together on this week's episode of the Scale HQ podcast.
Sean, thank you so much for coming on the Podcast Gurus podcast. We're going to talk today about your podcast, your business, and your advice to podcasters. Now, you have a pretty interesting concept, which is the Scale HQ podcast. So maybe to begin with, can you tell us the story of that show, please?
Scale HQ podcast. Well, fundamentally, Scale HQ is a business that I established to help founders scale up, and they usually want to do one of 3 things. They are seeking to continue to grow and scale, and they don't have a particular endpoint, or they have an endpoint and they want to work towards some kind of an exit, or they have the desire to step back and install management. So it's usually one of those 3 outcomes. And Scale HQ is a service business designed to help those founders scale up and achieve whatever one of those 3 outcomes they're looking for. Excuse me. So the Scale HQ podcast was a mechanism for me to, I wanted to make sure that I never fell into the trap of thinking that I knew everything, because I don't. I know what I'm good at, and I don't ever want to get confused about what I'm good at. And I think sometimes when you are, voraciously consuming content, or you're meeting other experts, or you're meeting other entrepreneurs, you can sometimes, inadvertently adopt an idea that actually may not be something you ever done. And I kind of hate that whole regurgitation of other people's stuff from people who haven't actually done it. So I've tried to remain pure in what it is that I'm good at, which is the scaling stage. For example, I don't really work with startups. I'm not a product market fit guy. I'm not the guy who's going to come up with the greatest idea. But once the business, particularly around the high 6 figures or low 7 figures, once the business is working, they've got product market fit, maybe they've got some resources, I'm the guy they come to help them figure out how to scale the business, because they've usually not done it before and the business is going well. And so Scale HQ was an opportunity for me to go, how do I help to bring other experts, both experts on areas of scaling that founders need to know about, or founders that have already scaled successfully before who can share their wisdom. And also I like hearing the stories of founders who are still scaling up. And so I use that mechanism to help create different perspectives on the same sort of sets of common problems, the same scaling challenges that I know that my clients will end up facing. So it just brings different flavor, different perspective, and that helps to make sure that they're making better and more rounded decisions.
I love that. And there is lots to unpack here. So scale is, I wouldn't say a bit of a buzzword, but almost. I mean, it can mean lots of different things. So maybe to go back to the basic definitions of it, and also what you do exactly. So can you put some metrics on this? What does it mean for you to scale a company?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I remember having a guest, and we had quite a big conversation about that. Is like, well, what does it mean to scale, and what does success look like, and all the rest. I think I would say that a business that is growing probably on the bottom line at least 30% year on year, and they have an EBITDA, unless they're going for a really large, I don't tend to deal with businesses that are going for super large scale. It's not really my space. They're typically services businesses They probably want a business that's doing somewhere between 5 and 50 million. They'll be happy with somewhere in that range. And if they're doing more than 30% EBITDA, they're usually pretty happy. 30% profit at the bottom line. Most of them are pretty happy. Excuse me. I have founders who've got 50 plus. I've got a couple of founders that have got low double digits, and I can tell you that the ones that have the lowest profit are always the most stressed, and the ones that have the highest profitability are always the least stressed and have the most options. And so, so in terms of scale, again, I don't enter any client engagement or enter with a view as to what the founder should achieve. But if they've got a business that is solid and growing at sort of 30% year on year at the bottom line, they're going to end up with a pretty decent business. And that means they're going to end up facing scaling challenges that are inevitable. No question, they're going to face them. Whether it's, having to, when do I hire the right leaders at what time and in what areas? How do I make sure I've got enough working capital to make this thing work? How am I going to make sure that my cash flow sort of doesn't run out, like blah, 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 the list goes on. There's many of those, but they're all inevitable if you've got a business that's at least achieving those kinds of metrics. And so you're going to end up in a position where you need to know what to do, and you're either going to have to continue to wing it, which many founders do, and some do very successfully on their own, but most find help from outside, from people who've been there before, because they don't want to screw it up. And the consequences get bigger, the bigger the business gets. So I don't think there's necessarily, when do you know if you're at scale? I think it's quite subjective. I know founders who are at 5 million who thinks their business has scaled. And I know founders who are at 30 million who think they're just getting started. So I think it's very much in the mind of the founder and their personal ambitions.
What makes you, one of the things you mentioned earlier is that I'm more into the scaling than into the starting. So I wouldn't help typical startups or like product market fit. Mm-hmm. What do you think makes you a great scaler? Like what is required to actually scale a business versus starting a business?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's two questions there. What makes me good at it? And then what is required? What is required is usually there's probably four things you've got to get right to scale a business. Number one, you have to get the growth strategy right. Because in the absence of a growth strategy, you don't know what to focus on. And what you do is you spend a whole bunch of time chasing random opportunities. And it's a very quick way to low profitability, to a confused workforce, to super, lots of inefficiency, lots of pain. So number one, got to get a growth strategy right. Number two, you got to get your business model right, because step one says, this is where I'm going to go. Step two says, this is the vehicle and the engine that is actually going to provide not only the profitability, but where, if you think about a Jim Collins type flywheel, like if your business model, if each step in the business model does not naturally lead to and build momentum towards the next step in the business model, then your effort is going to be going to lots of different directions. So you've got to make sure that if I run this business model in a full cycle, which probably I'm going through in, 90 days, from the time I acquire a customer to delivering whatever it is and getting paid by them. If I keep doing that, what is naturally building as a result? Is profitability building? Are my resources building? Like what's actually building in terms of momentum? So first, growth strategy. Second, business model. Third, execution foundations. A business has to get organized. And it's the process of like growing from being a business to a company. And that's a mindset shift, which if you've never done it before or you've never been in one, like, a lot of founders have spent 20 years or 10 years or whatever in some kind of a profession. They decide they want to do it on their own. They think they can do it better. They go and build a business. They start getting customers. The business gets to a million or a couple of million. It's going well. And then all of a sudden they go, ooh, all these people are relying on me. I don't really know when to do planning. I don't know how to communicate to them. I don't know how to build in feedback loops. I don't know how to do budgeting. Like, there's all this structural stuff that comes with building execution foundations. How do I organize this business in such a way that actually I can show people what success looks like for the company and for them? And I have all of the infrastructure in terms of meetings, agendas, planning, reporting, transparency, metrics, KPIs, all this stuff that makes execution work and makes it efficient. So that's the third thing that they have to do to scale. So now they've got a growth strategy, the business model works. they're putting in the execution foundation so things start to become rhythmic, less random, more structured, more like a pulse to the business. And then fourth, if those things are going well, then I encourage founders to materially invest, whether it's their own capital, investment capital, working capital. There's lots of different ways to do it. Then really invest in customer acquisition, which of course is usually the first thing they try to do as opposed to the last thing they try to do. But ultimately, if all those other three things are working well, you're going to have a business that should scale much better. So now's the time to put pressure on the top end and push more volume into it so that you get the value out of all that stuff that you've just done. So those are the four things I think you have to do well in order to scale a business, and to have something that's sellable. Because I always talk to my founders about the idea of optionality, meaning sort of maximum scale and maximum exit optionality. You may choose never to exit, but if you build your business in such a way that it's always exit ready, then you always have options. You can step back from it, you can keep scaling it up, or you can sell it. And so you always want to build with that in mind so that you have all of your options. You don't get to the point where you've had enough of the business and you haven't done that stuff. And then you have this really painful period because you want to get out, but no one wants to buy it. No one wants to invest in it. It's a bit of a problem. So that's a long-winded way of saying those are the four things you need to get right: growth strategy, business model, execution, and then the customer acquisition, scalable customer acquisition model. Those are the four things. And then what makes me good at it is that I got practice, and I didn't actually grow up as a founder. I came through the corporate side. I became a professional CEO in my mid-30s. I grew up in sales and marketing, blah, blah, blah. But the last couple of CEO jobs I had, particularly the last one where I was engaged to build an education portfolio for an investment, publicly listed investment company. What I had to figure out was how, if I'm going to buy a bunch of businesses and we're going to put them together in a group, and my success or failure is determined on how well I can do those four things: get the right strategy in place, optimize the business model, lay the execution foundations, and then dial up the customer acquisition. How am I going to build a framework that's going to allow me to do that in big entities where they might already have $30 million of revenue, and $1 and $2 and $3 million businesses, or even startup businesses potentially? And so what I did was I spent a lot of time researching and learning and devouring books and trying everything. And I built my own methodology with my team to pull all of those pieces together so that we could kind of pick it up and apply it to any business that we bought or any business that we built. And we did both. And by the time I left, I think we had 6 entities. And I think those guys probably have 10 entities now, because I left about 3 years ago and they're still growing. I left at about, if we started at 3 mil, I left at 50. I think they're probably closer to 100 now. But the thing that made me good at it is that I have, I think, some founders, some CEOs or some founders, some are really good at strategy and terrible at detail. And some are really great executors, really good at detail, and actually terrible at strategy. I'm quite lucky that I really enjoy both of them. It doesn't mean I'm the world's foremost expert at both of them, but I actually really like both of them. So I was always able to see where the business needed to go, lay out an execution path, rally people around it, get them excited, get everyone in the right roles with the right project plans, get everybody moving. And then as soon as I'd done that, I got bored. So I was terrible at maintenance. So I needed to find a way to do that. And that's why the sort of portfolio model worked well for me, because it played to my strengths. But that's all we did, was just try to get those 4 things right in each of those businesses.
Love that. How much scale or how much scaling is too much scaling? Is there a point where a company, because of its scale, is actually going to collapse on itself? And how do you prevent that from happening?
That's a hard question. I think that really relies upon how well you've built into the DNA the ability to innovate and the ability to take risks, because that is usually what starts to fail when the business gets too big. And I say this a lot to founders: if you scale too quickly, that's why I'm like the annoying guy who says, stop trying to just master customer acquisition, because that's what they all want to do. Naturally, they're founders. They want to grow. They want top line growth. They want money. That's what they think is the answer. But they cause themselves so much pain when they grow too fast and the other things aren't in place. It is an absolute nightmare. And businesses can fail on the way up very quickly. Actually, a scary stat for your listeners is that in Australia, at least, there's a guy I know who's done, his company's done almost 200 turnarounds. They're like corporate restructuring business. They just do turnarounds. And his stat was that of the businesses that have passed $1 million in Australia, of those who fail after the $1 million, because obviously lots fail before $1 million, but after $1 million, they, business is working. Of those that fail, 50% of the failures happen within 12 months of the record year of growth. And that tells you that is a scaling problem. That's crazy. Because that means you did not have your stuff together before you turned the tap on and things just started breaking. The revenue comes in, the quality doesn't scale, the brand doesn't scale, the service doesn't scale, the systems don't scale, the blah, 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 the list goes on. So that is, to me, when you end up with too much, you end up with a really high risk of growing too quickly. And some businesses obviously continue to do it really well because they've actually thought about the thing that makes the business model work. Take Intel. Intel, massive scale, huge business, global leader, no question in chips. But built into their flywheel is how they reinvest their profits. What do they reinvest their profits into? Research and development. That's why they have at scale stayed the leaders of their field, because that's actually where they plow all their money, because that is their differentiator. Everything else flows from that. Or, Vanguard, who haven't lost sight of the fact that they're trying to build the lowest cost, stocks and mutual funds business in the world. So where do they channel all their money? They use that scale to continue to drive down prices to make sure that that value proposition never gets broken, even as they get larger. And so I think the issue is when the business gets consumed with scaling and just getting bigger and feeding the machine. And it is all consuming. Like, it is super consuming, trying to make sure that everybody's fed and everyone's happy and everyone's cared for and all that stuff. But actually what gets lost is if you don't have a really clear understanding of that value proposition, what makes it important, the connectivity to your customers, and the ability, therefore, to innovate and continue to drive and take risks around the product, the service, to make sure that the customers are still being satisfied in the best way possible, better than everybody else, then that is the point when you're scaling is going to be your path to a massive failure, like a Kodak or a Motorola or many of the other examples that we all know.
Wow. Is it so? Does the industry of the business that you help scaling matters? By that I mean, you obviously, or at least from my perspective, wouldn't scale a business that is brick and mortar versus digital the same way. You wouldn't scale a business that is online education based versus physical product based the same way. So how do you make sure to always look at it from the tailored perspective of the very industry or niche that you're in? And is it always the same principle at the end of the day that you just adapt to each industry?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I definitely think the industry knowledge is not so much the question, because there's very few businesses that need more industry knowledge. You look around the executive table, and between the founder and their senior leaders, there'll be like 100 years of industry knowledge sitting right in front of you. So actually they don't need more industry knowledge. It's pretty rare. What they do need is real clarity around the mechanics of what makes that business model work. And that is different in every industry. For example, if you are building a face-to-face education business, of which I've built many, understanding how to optimize, like how long you should probably take from the investing in the capital of the campus before it gets ready, how to make sure that you've got, cohorts ready to go, how to make sure that you get your instructor model well optimized, what's the minimum level of gross profit per instructor hour that you need. Like, there is a lot of industry knowledge that can come from people who've scaled the same kind of business, who they may only understand what does a well-optimized, scaled business model in your industry look like. And that is absolutely valuable information, because otherwise, if you've got an advisor, say like me, they will be having to learn that with you, and they may be guessing. And so I'm very clear that I tend to primarily I work with services businesses, because I understand the mechanics of business models and commercial models where somebody is selling knowledge, time, some kind of intangible, more so than a product. For example, I took on a client who does manufacturing. And my first comment was, just so you know, I don't know anything about manufacturing. Like, I don't know what at first glance, I don't know what the optimal gross profit you should be operating in your kind of segment. I don't know, because I've never done that before. What I can do, to your sort of question, as implied in your question, is, are there principles that make sense? Well, absolutely. There are definitely principles that make sense. And I think they probably get you 80% of the way. And there is 20% of optimization that you may not realize without some of that experience from someone in your industry who can call out a number and go, there's something wrong with that number there. That does not make sense. If you have that number, then you've got a problem further downstream. Now, you can learn that with the right sort of set of optics, but it does take additional time. So I think in services businesses, the vast majority of time, if you understand service business models well, you can get a good, clear, the principles will apply in most. But I think that does definitely change in, an e-commerce business, in a manufacturing business, in a mining business. Like, they all have different business models and commercial models that make them work.
Oh, I love that. We are talking very little about podcasts, but it's gonna come, I promise. I'm just so interested into this thing. So, Sean, another question about this. You've recorded more than 100 episodes, right? About scaling. You've increased revenues of companies you've held by $100 million throughout your career. What's the thing that nobody asks you about scale, or that everybody underestimates, but yet you're like, this is something people don't think of and I don't get asked enough about, but that everybody should bear in mind when they are trying to scale a business? Sorry, that's not a softball.
No, that's a great question. I think one of the underrated, one of the most underrated resources a founder can have is a peer and I say like a support network. I remember actually being asked in my first CEO interview, they said, when things get really hard, who do you turn to? Not like generally, like who specifically and for what? So when you have a problem with, you've got a senior leader, that you've got to fire tomorrow, and then, next week you've got to do a restructure of 100 roles, and then the next week you need to raise capital. Like, in these circumstances, who are you going to for support and knowledge? Because you can't possibly know it all. And if you wing it, that's actually high risk for us as the people backing you as the CEO. And so what I loved about that was it wasn't even like, there was not even a premise that they would expect the CEO to know everything. The premise is you have to be better than everybody else at accessing the resources that get you the answers faster than anybody else. Kind of like, now why you wonder when kids are prepping for exams where they've still got to memorize everything, and you're going, they're literally just going to pick up their phone in the real world. The question is, how well do they ask the question? How well can they discern, dodgy answers from credible answers? How well can they get perspective and experience beyond what they see written on a web page? Those resources for a founder, I would say, are not always obvious because they have usually built their business off the back of winging it, acting confidently even when they're not feeling confident. And they realize very quickly that the bigger the business gets, the lonelier it gets, and the harder the decisions get, and the greater the consequences get. And that all of a sudden becomes quite an isolating place for a founder. So I would say, don't underestimate the value of a peer network of people that you can tap into. And they may be peers, they may be mentors, they may be advisors, they may be consultants, but it's more like, who are the people that you're going to go to? I've always got, I got asked the other day, how did I get through, what do I do when I'm under massive pressure in a crisis? And I have a list of people. Like, my model of the world is there's probably close to 10 people on that speed dial. And depending on the issue, I will get in front of 5 of them as quickly as I can with 15 minutes of each of them and go, this is the problem I'm facing. What would you do if you were me? And I use that to challenge my mind and open my perspective so I can make a better informed decision on the way forward. I would never think that I have got the right answer, but I'm better than most people at getting access to wisdom and knowledge that help me make a better choice than I probably would have made myself. And so I think that sort of humility and that network is an important one for founders to build.
So first of all, speaking hard truth here, and definitely feeling targeted, but that's all good. It makes sense. So one of the things I'm trying to learn lately, Sean, is sales. And one of the great advice, so I bought a training online, and I think one of the great advice that they give in that training is, hey, one of the things you need to do when you learn sales is also to record your calls and get it listened to by somebody who's going to give you advice. And they're also like, the worst thing you can do, though, is to go to an unexperimented salesperson or somebody who has never done sales and ask for their advice. I'm thinking about this because I'm like, how do you make sure that the people you go to will actually steer you in the right direction? Are you just looking for an external opinion, or are you really looking for an advice for the specific problem you're facing?
That's a great question. I try to get a mix.
Okay.
Because just because someone's been there before, I think it's great to have someone who's built a business similar to yours that you can, I think it's good to have peers at a similar level, and therefore it's perspective, right? I've got a group of, I have my own sort of global mastermind group of 5 founders. One's running a company with 650 people. Some are running, $2, $3, and $4 million businesses. Some have already got, installed CEOs. Like, it's a big range of people, but none of them have built a business like mine. So I don't go to any of them making the assumption that they know exactly how to build my kind of business, but they're all going to bring different perspective, and they're all experienced and successful in their own right. If I had an education business problem, I would go straight to my former CEO or my former managing director when I was an executive, who's the smartest person I know in education. And I don't think there's much that he couldn't tell me that I could present to him that he wouldn't know how to handle. So if I needed like industry specific knowledge, he'd be the first person I would call. But if I want perspective from outside my industry, and that to me is super valuable, because people ask you questions that you're not thinking about because you've already normalized your whole industry and all the problems in it, and all the, you get very constrained in either your local area or your local market or your industry perspective. And then somebody asks you a question that seems so simple, but you hadn't even thought about because it seems obvious to you, but maybe you're thinking about it the wrong way. So I try to get a diversity of those who've already done it before, and those who've never done it before will never have done it, but are going to challenge me with good questions. Like, I have one friend who's always the first one that I go to, and it's always the hardest call, because I know that he's going to ask me really difficult questions about the risk and the downside and what could go wrong, and here's all the things that could go wrong with that. And that's not how my brain naturally thinks.
Right.
So they're hard things for me to wrestle with, but I know I need to hear them. So I seek them out actively because I know I'll make a better decision as a result. And for me, it's about trying to get a group of perspectives so that I always make the best decision, and I will always make that decision. So I'd never just take one view and go, well, they said that's how it must be, so that's how it is. I try to get wider sets and then just make a call that intuitively feels the best decision I can make at the time with all that information.
Okay, I love this, but let me challenge it. Just for the sake of challenging it, but also to see how far you can go with this. One of the things I understood, so I used to follow somebody who is like speaking a lot about startups and help lots of startups raise funds in France from like 2010 to 2016. So at the time where it wasn't easy to raise money as a startup in France. And they were like, okay, think about this. You are in a competition with the smartest people in the world. 9 decisions out of 10 that they make is the correct one. But they can only make a decision every month. And you, the dumber person in the place, but you make a decision every day and you are wrong 90% of the time. Yet, by the end of the 30 days, you will have made 3 right decisions, because rapidity of execution matters more than always making the right decision. Are you, by seeking advice to that many people, not slowing down a bit the process of decision making and eventually delivering on what that decision is meant to come for?
That's excellent question. And yes, if I was doing that on every decision, absolutely. I mean, that would not be practical. So I'm talking about more major decisions, big forks in the road, parts where you feel overwhelmed, parts where you're thinking, this has real consequences. And in the absence of those, so, I wouldn't be calling those people every week. That might be, once every couple of months, where I'm facing just a really big one that I can't wrestle through myself, or it's too complex for my mind, or I know I'm lost in it and I just don't have perspective. And in between that, you're making 100 decisions a day, you know, I don't know how many you're making a day, but you're making a lot. And they're absolutely short and micro, and you just have to keep making them with the best. You know, I always think that you'll make the best decision that you can always with the resources you have available. The question is, are you also developing yourself in the areas where you need more resources? Because we're on a podcast, you know, today, and we might have a whole bunch of listeners who just love podcasts, and they're just devouring them, you know, one after another. And they don't really know what they're listening for. I don't know. They're just sort of hoping that some wonderful thing gets said and it sparks some, you know, magical leap from where they are to where they need to go, as opposed to thinking, I want to be at B and I'm currently at A. What skills or experience do I not have right now that I need to learn to get from A to B? Which seems very logical.
Exactly.
But how many of us do that? We have such a confused, you know, just have such a torrent of content coming at us all the time. It's so easy to end up in that passive, receptive professional development model rather than going, let's imagine we go back 30 years where we didn't have all this input and we just said, hey, I want to get to here. I don't know how to get to there. What are the 3 books that I can find where someone's going to explain to me how they did it? And that's what I need to learn. That's what I put all my effort into. And so I guess my point is, you can make a lot of decisions, but if you're finding yourself having to make a lot of decisions in an area in which you don't actually have the skills or the knowledge base to do that well, then you better step up your professional development game pretty quickly and find very problem-specific resources, not broad, inspirational, let's hope for a diamond in the rough type resources that help you knock over that issue.
Oh, so many golden nuggets here. How would you scale a podcast? How would you do that?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Yes, we got him. Yeah. We got him.
I don't know, because I've actually never had it as a goal. I know, which sounds crazy, like I'm the Scale HQ guy, but I never built Scale HQ to be a super scalable business model. It was never my early intention. And the podcast, of course, people have all sorts of goals for their podcasts. My goal was not to build a massive fan base or, you know, huge amounts of, you know, engagement and likes and all the rest. Actually, my greatest utility for the podcast is for founders that I support. And I know the founders I support don't listen to every podcast. That's fine. But I'm able to use them as resources. Mm-hmm. So when we're dealing with a problem, I can go, I interviewed somebody in episode 54. Let me bring that out. Here's the link. Go back and listen to this episode, and then let's have a conversation in our next meeting about what you think about that. And I leverage it as a resource. So yes, it exposes, you know, potential clients to me in the way that I think. And so that's valuable, and, you know, there's credibility and all that comes with that. But actually for me, that is my primary goal. It wasn't to scale it. So I have not done the learning required to know the answer to that question. I definitely know that that the majority of people, number one, who do podcasting give up before 6 episodes. So there's not that many of us that sort of get to 100 or past 100, because it obviously takes time and money and resources and all the rest, and serious commitment. But also
100%.
The objective needs to be clear. So, you know, I know some will, what I was going to say was that the distribution of your podcast, of course, whether you want it to be big scale or small scale, is actually probably the most, like everyone, you know, when you start a podcast, you would have experienced this as well. There's a lot of learning, man. Like I tried to get, I don't know, at least 3 different marketing teams that I led to help me build a podcast, and none of them wanted to pick it up. You know, they all gave me different reasons. And I think they were all just scared because they'd never done it before. And I was like, I really want to learn how to podcast. I'm going to learn this stuff. And there was a big learning curve there, and to get my head around it and all the rest. But then it all became second nature, and you get past that. The distribution, however, so many different ways to do that. Is it going to be monetized? Are you going to be doing paid ads? Like, where does it actually fit into your ecosystem or your marketing funnel, however you want to describe it? Is it like an awareness generator? Is it to help people who are at evaluation stage? Is it to help you find new clients? Like, what is the actual purpose of your podcast? Because it needs to fit somewhere in your ecosystem in a way that makes sense. And so the distribution might just be, I know you're reaching out to people on LinkedIn and you're sending them a copy of the last podcast because it starts a conversation. Okay, well, that's the purpose of the podcast. So yeah, that was a long-winded way of saying I definitely have no idea what the best way is to scale a podcast because I haven't had that ambition.
But I love this answer because I think it comes down to a fundamental point that you quickly touched upon earlier, but it's like, what's the initial objective as well of your company, of what you're trying to achieve? Like even before getting into the scaling, do you have the proper product? Do you have the proper processes in place? If we start feeding the machine and open the tap, will you be able to receive all this flow? And then what are we optimizing for? And by giving this answer, you're explaining, hey, start with the why are you even starting a podcast? Because maybe it's not about reaching millions of people. Maybe it's about reaching a few thousands of people in your very niche that you can appear as a thought leader in, or maybe it's to connect with people, or maybe it's to have content for your blog, whatever it is, and then double down on this. So on your side, the way I understand it is, if it's the greatest use of it is to be able to send it to clients. So it's not even a marketing mid-funnel asset. It's just like within the company, having resources available that are also accessible by anybody so they see you. I think that's a great way. So if you were to apply your logic of the Scale HQ, a podcast that aims at getting as much audience as possible, reach as many people as possible, what will be the fundamental principles that you'd be applying here once you're like, okay, the objective is reaching as many people as possible. How do you approach this problem with like, okay, it's probably going to be making money through sponsorship or maybe just by paid episodes because people want to come on the show. We recently interviewed John Lee Dumas from Entrepreneurs on Fire, and that ended up being the business model because he interviewed 30 people a month, but 400 people asked to be on the show a month. So he's like, guys, as of now, it's $3,500 to come on the show. So the bigger the audience, the bigger the sponsorship contracts or the fee to come on the show will be. That being said, what are the fundamental scaling principles to apply if you want to take that to the next level?
Well, I think just to take one step back, I think that's a very interesting comment because I agree with you. The greater the scalability, the greater the set of options as to what you can do with it, and also the greater the requirement of your time to continue to invest in it. Because no one gets to a podcast that has, 300 people asking to be part of it every month, paying $3,500. No one does that without serious investment, lots of rhythm, huge, that almost becomes the entire business. You know what I mean? Like I'd imagine that founder's spending a hell of a lot of time on the podcast. And so a big thing for me was, how do I reduce this to the minimum possible amount of time that I need to invest in a podcast? I don't want to spend any more than 2 hours a fortnight doing my podcast. Like that's my maximum time allocated. That includes booking the guest, prepping for the guest, recording the episode, sending the files on, and then everything else happens through other, content marketer and the person doing the production and all the rest. So the other thing that I would say about, and this is me guessing because this is not me speaking from experience, but what I would notice, what I observe about podcasts and scalable podcasts is that the personal brand fundamentally matters more than the podcast content, almost. Like the likability of the person, their investment in their personal brand. Like I feel like we're at this, if I could draw a diagram, I would show that we have, overlapping lines where if you go back 5 years, I feel like if we were watching, I don't know, Instagram likes or Facebook likes or something like that, people following companies versus people following founders and founder brands. And I feel like that balance has tipped. And I would say in terms of growth, it might be a growth rate thing, or I don't know whether they might still be both growing, but actually the rate of people following personal brands is way higher in the last 5 years. And I don't know if it's got anything to do with COVID and we were isolated and we were looking for, someone to guide us through. I don't know. But I think the podcasting scalability, is there a single podcast that you can think of that's in the, top 100 in the world that is not backed by that, where it's almost like a faceless brand has, 7 different presenters because it doesn't really matter because the content's so good, it doesn't really matter who's delivering it. Like that you would probably know better than I do. I don't know any, but maybe there are some. Don't think there is. So so how do you apply the scaling principles? Well, I think the 4 things will still apply, the 4 key principles that you have to get right to scale. You have to have a growth strategy. So you have to have a clear understanding of how, by focusing in on a couple of, let me quickly explain how to do growth strategy at a super high level.
Yeah.
You got to get clear about where you want to end up. You got to think about the kind of environment you're going to be facing, where the disruption and everything's going to be coming from, where are the trends, like what's happening. You need to set some midpoint type goals. You need to work through what are fundamentally the 2 to 3 things, not the 10 things, not the 100 things. What are the 2 to 3 things which, if I really invest in them and double down on those 2 to 3 things, that in somewhere between probably 3 and 7 years, I'm going to have a real competitive advantage. Not like a little one, like it's going to grow and it's going to keep getting bigger, and probably no one's going to see it coming. And you know what? It's going to deliver probably very limited short-term revenue or excitement in the short term. It's a medium-term play because strategy is competitive advantage. That is all it is. It's the development, it's competitive advantage in the future. So the same would apply in the podcasting sphere. If you were thinking, I want to build the world's sort of leading, podcast platform, it's not like you're going to start on day one with 350 people knocking down your door wanting to pay you $3,500 to get on. So what did that founder double down on? What were the 2 or 3 things that they did that in the medium term, as the business started to build and their brand built, that they got known for a couple of things, or that maybe it was the uniqueness of their content, or the way they built their personal brand, or the business model that sat behind it, whatever it was, they had a clear strategy for it. Second, they have to have a business model that makes sense commercially. Like, okay, what are the steps in my flywheel? Every time somebody comes to me, it generates $3,500. The very next thing that happens is they tell 5 friends, that does this. Like, what's the actual business model? How does it turn into profitability and therefore resources? And how do you rechannel those resources into the competitive advantage so that it continues to get stronger? So step 2 is the business model. Step 3 then is you need execution foundations. You guys will be experiencing this now because you've got lots of clients coming on board. It's like, okay, if we get good at 1 and 2 and it starts working, we're going to have a problem pretty fast because we're a services business fundamentally, in the case that we're talking about, and probably most podcasts off the back of them also services businesses if they've got a big one. How are we going to have the people, the systems, the process design, the customer experience, etc., that is actually going to continue to scale as we grow? Because if that starts to deteriorate, our brand is going backwards in a hurry, and it's a founder's nightmare. It is an absolute nightmare when all of a sudden the thing that you love the most, that everybody knows you for, is starting to fall apart, and you can't keep your hands on it anymore, and you have to sort of delegate, but actually it just wasn't put together very well, and it just starts cracking at the seams with the growth. That's an awful place to be. So the podcast founder is going to have to build some execution foundations in the way that they hire people, in the way that work moves through the pipeline, the sort of production rhythms. All that stuff's going to have to become very systematic so that as a founder, I put this thing in the top of that funnel, and out the other side of that sausage factory is an amazing customer experience that every single time that the client loves, and that's something worth scaling. That's something worth then putting pressure on the front end. So now that I've got those 3 things, how do I now amplify my voice? Do I run paid ads? Do I need to bring a sales team? Do I have some scalable lead generation model? Like, what is going to now put fuel on the fire of this business model and dial it right up? Which if I've done the other 3 things, I should be able to do successfully with my podcast.
Whew, I have the chills. 2 things I want to follow up on what you said, Sean. The first thing is, yes, we definitely see personal branding of founders exceeding the success of branded profiles on social media. I think one of the explanations I can come up with is people buy from people, not from company. It's all about that connection, and eventually you will see behind the scenes and you will feel much more connected to a person than to a logo, I guess. And the other thing you mentioned that got me thinking is scaling versus time. You say, I want to invest as little time as possible. To keep the product viable and good, but in my podcast. And it's the same thing with any podcast that you like to scale. If you are about the interviews, it's always going to be your time versus something. It's going to be your time versus maybe more and more money. But is it skill that you can achieve with that? Now you got me thinking. I'm going to have to reflect on this. Absolutely love that.
The thing I love about simplicity of some, every now and again, there's founders that I meet that really just blow me away with how lean. So if we go back to the concept of scale and actually what does success look like for that founder? So I interviewed a founder probably a year ago who runs a business called Cardly, and it's like beautiful handwritten greeting cards with all sorts of styles. It's just like the UX experience on this website is absolutely unbelievable. It is so good, and it integrates with your CRM, so you can set everything on autopilot. Cool. Like it's just excellent. And that business, a year ago was doing $3 million revenue, and there's only the two co-founders. That's it. No other employees. Everything else is done through partners, like the printing's done by somebody else, the postage is done by somebody else. Like they just do the system, and that business is doing $3 million. And so for them, they're like, well, their gross profit might be 80% of the $3 million. And they're like, well, we're making 2.6 off of 3 million. Like, does it need to be any more scale than that? I don't know. We're getting $1.3 million each year in dividends. Does it need to get any bigger? I met a couple of course creators who I won't mention their names. But they are two guys who've built some digital marketing courses, and their business probably is also doing, I'd say it'd have to be somewhere between like 3 and 4 million, probably US a year. And they spend 6 months of the year traveling. They just sort of update their content. Somebody else does the sales and marketing. Again, I don't want to give too much away, but their idea of scale is flexibility and freedom. And they're also probably making a couple of $1 million a year each, and have no ambitions whatsoever to hire a single person to scale it up, to make it any bigger. It's like, hey, this is pretty good. And so I think it comes back to that. I think this is you asked probably about the scaling, like what people don't ask me about scaling. And maybe it comes, maybe this is the second point. The profitability of your business model is the number one, I think, the number one determinant of founder stress levels and comfort and joy in their business. And that sounds like clinical and it's all about money. And it's not all about money. If they're delivering a good product and service, they're creating value in the world, amazing. That's exactly what they should be doing. I don't work with anyone who doesn't do that. But the founder that's got the $20 million business that's doing 10%, they are stressed, man. The founder who's doing 4 million and is doing 50% EBITDA, who's making the same money but has 6 people instead of 80, I can tell you, they work less, they play more, they're happier, they've got all the options in the world. And so I think Hormozi said this. Hormozi said this really well. He said, don't spend 10 out of 10 time on a 2 out of 10 opportunity. So is the business, sometimes we fall into these business models just because they just kind of evolve. Hey, I really like doing that. That's interesting. Oh, people ask me to do this, blah, blah, blah. You end up in a business, right? But sometimes we haven't stepped back and said, is this business model going to turn into at least a 30% EBITDA plus business? And am I actually going, when it's at scale, what would that mean for how I have to spend my time? Because some founders really enjoy the process of scaling up and having to become basically a CEO and learn that there's a lot of professional development that goes into that. There's a lot of new learning. It's not comfortable. And some absolutely hate it and would rather have the 6 people and no big business and all the rest. And so I think you actually have to really wrestle with that as a founder. Whether you're building a podcast business or any other, is when this is at scale, don't just keep pushing without really thinking that through. Is the profitability going to get larger? What does it mean for how I spend my time? Are the things that I'm going to have to spend my time on going to give me energy or take energy away from me? That is something that we usually go, oh, that's a bit hard to think about. And I've got 75 tasks to do today. I'll get to that later. Get on the 75 tasks. So I think maybe that's like the second thing, like profitability tends to be the thing that unlocks all the options, all the joy, all the happiness, all the choices for founders, because you can always then have money to hire somebody else to do the things that you don't like. And when profitability is tight, you usually don't have the money to hire great people.
That's amazing. Sean, we often end those interviews with a question we ask everybody. What are 3 podcasts that you recommend? What are 3 podcasts that you, Sean, listen to that you would say, hey, those are great pieces of content? It can be business related, scale related, or not at all. And of course, you cannot say Scale HQ podcast, but we'll definitely put the link in the description as well.
3 podcasts that I listen to or would recommend. Okay, number 1. So I always try to make sure I don't give advice. I don't give any advice on strategies or anything that I haven't done before. So that's important to know, because I am also then the advice that I gave before around it's easy to fall into a trap of having a mental diet that's very passive as opposed to actively controlling your professional development. I had heard that from another founder on a podcast ages ago, and it really made me look at all the podcasts I was listening to and all the, the 6 books that I was halfway through reading each of beside my bed. And I thought, this is insane. Like, I know exactly what I need to do. I know exactly what I need to learn in the next 12 months. And actually, I literally turned off all of my podcasts. I put all of those books in the cupboard, and I had one book, and I got up every day and I spent 20 minutes on that book, and I took out my Notion and I wrote notes at the end of that 20 minutes reading, 20 minutes typing. Next day, 20 minutes reading, 20 minutes typing. And it took me ages. It probably took me 6 months to actually get through the book, but I now have, there's nothing that's in that book that I'm not going to get value from, because I have fully internalized it and absorbed it. So only in the last, I reckon I haven't listened to a podcast in 6 months until maybe a month ago, which is the opposite of what I would have said to you 12 months ago. So I literally turned off my diet so I could control it, my mental diet, and I've replacing things in very carefully. So the one podcast that I'm listening to, and I don't listen to it religiously, the one podcast I listen to is Alex Hormozy's podcast, because I really think he cuts through a lot of crap. The Game. Really Amazing. Good. Really good. And I've got an 18-year-old son who's just getting into his personal development, and he very, honored me by asking me what he thought he should listen to. And I was like, it's a huge responsibility for me. Because I take it really seriously. I've always invested in his personal development. And I was like, Hormozy, that's it. Don't listen to anything else until you know what that's just for, really shaping your business mindset. And then when you've got a skill that you want to learn, let me know, and then we'll find the right podcast for that. So, so Hormozy, I still have a couple of friends' podcasts that I listen to, and they're both property podcasts, but just because I love to hear their voice.
That's beautiful.
And I like the way that they talk. And actually, I'm going to do nothing with that information. It's actually almost it's a weird way of me sort of remaining connected to them. So I won't recommend them here, but that's actually the only podcasting I've got going on in my life right now, which is weird for me to say, because I would have given you 15 that I had on sort of auto dial. Actually, there is one other, and that is me trying to make sure that I don't spend all my time thinking about work. Excuse me. There's a pair of comedians in Australia who have the #1 comedy podcast called Hamish and Andy. And they just crack me up. And so when I need to think about nothing serious and just laugh at 2 idiots who've been best friends since they were in university and now, got kids in their mid-40s and they're still just as funny as they ever were, I listen to Hamish and Andy just to sort of remove my brain from work for a while.
God, I think I will have to give a go to that one then. But Sean, you cannot get away without giving us the name of that book that you read then. I mean, we usually do podcasts, but here I think we can afford a little tweak to the common rule. So what was that book that you spent 6 months on? If you can share.
The name of the book was Sell Like Crazy.
Okay.
Yeah, Sell Like Crazy by Sabri Subi.
Interesting. Exactly in the middle of that right now, so I might just give a go.
And not because... Oh, are you? Yeah, I think, I always try to be cautious about gurus, and I think it's like the way that I reach out for resources and then I make my own decision. I'm looking for the principles. There's lots of businesses that I'm not sure that Sabri's model apply all that nicely to. I don't know, if you're Gucci or Prada or something, are you going to be writing a long form, hardcore selling copy with really catchy, you're probably not, because it's not really the brand. It's not the luxury sort of end you're going for. But there's plenty of businesses that it does apply to. And there's lots of principles that can be applied in different ways. And so I really liked when I always scan first. Having done some speed reading courses, I try to, get really quickly into trying to identify what's the 2% that's going to matter in this book. And then I decide whether I'm going to read it properly. And if I read it, then I'm going to go all in. And so, yeah, I'm almost finished that.
And so when I said I'm in the middle of that, learning sales, but I will definitely give a go at that book. So what are the learnings that you could share with us, and most importantly here with me, about sales like crazy? Like what's the main key takeaway that you're like, okay, this really unlocked my capacity to sell?
I would say that it's probably less of a reflection for me and more a reflection of what I hear from founders on a regular basis. You need two things to have a scalable acquisition system. You need to ensure that when you receive a lead, you've actually got a really efficient process that converts at a higher rate to turn it into a customer. And I see a lot of founders, when they start to succeed, try to outsource sales process design and conversion design and everything to a salesperson. Big fat mistake. Do not do that. Go back to Scale HQ podcast and listen to the 3 interviews that I did. The only founder I've done 3 interviews with, Tilly LaCroix from Empel, works with smaller businesses mostly. One was on how do you set up the sales foundations to make sure that you actually get the conversion right. Then the other one was about sales recruitment. The other one was about sales management fundamentally. But the point being, you need 2 things for a scalable acquisition system. One, you need to have a process that actually works, is understood, has all the right ingredients, gets the conversion rate up. Then, and only then, should you bother investing in a scalable lead generation system, which is what Sabri does, really. It's partly offer design, but it's also about scalable lead generation. How do you build a model that's actually going to bring in the inquiries? And you could use Sabri's model, or you could use 1,000 other models that, Sabri doesn't teach. But what I take out of Sabri's is, I think it has some really interesting ideas on ways that you can build compelling lead magnets that are centered around the problems of the customer and that get their attention, elevate themselves above the noise, so you have an opportunity to engage with them. But I don't think it teaches you how to sell necessarily, but it gets people to the door. But if you focus on that first, before you've actually if you've already got some leads coming from somewhere, then you should really be focusing on measuring and improving how you're actually engaging with the leads. Because again, otherwise you're going to put a whole bunch of fuel in the fire. You're going to waste a lot of time, a lot of money. You're going to think all of a sudden, I've got leads coming from everywhere. I need to get a salesperson. But actually your conversion process still sucks. Now you're just going to be pouring money down the toilet. It's a terrible idea. You've got to do it in reverse. Conversion first, then scalable lead generation. And then once you've got those 2 things, you can actually build a customer acquisition system that really works and can grow.
Sean Steele, ladies and gentlemen. Sean, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Gurus.
Really enjoyed myself. Thank you so much for having me. The team here at Scale HQ hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Now, if you want to achieve scale, but you want to know what's going to hold you back, we can help. Head over to scalehq.com.au/growth score to get your free 9-page growth score report. That's going to help you understand where your top 3 barriers are to scale. And if you'd like, we'll even do a free debrief on the report for you with no obligations or expectations, just lots of value from some CEOs who've scaled to help you on your journey. That's scalehq.com.au/growth score and find out what's holding you back from fulfilling the potential of your business today.